Nightmare in the Dusk, Isabel Sterling and the Moment of Truth. The late afternoon casts a golden glow over the old oak trees, dyeing the facades of the luxurious villas hidden behind meticulously trimmed hedges orange. The black asphalt silently supports the wheels of the Mercedes S-Class, sleek as a mirror, sliding through the space with the grace of a ballet dancer in an upscale street. Isabel Sterling, in her 40s, retains the cool, sharp demeanor of someone used to making life-or-death decisions in the most urgent rooms of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Her neutral business suit accentuates her neatness, and her sharp eyes, now somewhat softened by a day of stressful meetings, still sparkle with her signature confidence. She is on her way back to her home, where the piano and candlelight should be waiting for her as a reward for her long hours of stress. But that peace was shattered the moment a red and green light flashed behind her. Isabel glanced in the rearview mirror. 2 local cops, their faces stone cold, were motioning for her to pull over. No sirens, no expressions, just a cold, commanding presence. She stopped. The window rolled down slowly. Not for speeding, not for a traffic violation, just for a dark tan and a car so luxurious they could believe the person behind the wheel was the rightful owner. Their glances met, then back at her, filled with icy contempt. The first words out of her mouth were not a request for papers, but a hideous suggestion: if you don't want trouble, be reasonable. Isabel raised her head, her voice calm but firm. I won't bribe. And I haven't committed any violations. As soon as the refusal was finished, hell broke loose. The hateful curses, the racist and sexist language, slapped her like an invisible whip. They yanked open the door, handcuffed her without explanation, and dragged her out of the car like a dangerous criminal, right in the middle of a quiet neighborhood where the silence was now the echo of injustice. They didn't know what they were doing. They didn't know who the woman they were humiliating was. They didn't know that just hours earlier, she had sat at the head of a national strategy meeting. That in her wallet was a high-ranking FBI agent's badge, with access to classified files and networks of power that stretched across the United States. And then, at the police station, when her identity was confirmed, the air in the room seemed to stop. The paleness spread across the faces of the 2 officers like winter frost. No more arrogant words, no more false authority, only fear and despair. They begged, they argued, but all their words were meaningless. Isabel sat up straight, her eyes cold as they crumbled before her. And then the story was rewritten, not just in disciplinary records, but in an unforgettable lesson about power misused, about pride exposed, and about justice, sometimes late, but never missed. She had done nothing wrong. Nothing. And yet she, the black woman behind the wheel, had been forced to stop at the side of the road like a criminal. Isabel slowed down, flashed her signal, and pulled over quietly. She turned off the music, rolled down the driver's side window halfway, and waited. A few seconds later, an old patrol car stopped a short distance away. The door opened, and 2 officers got out. Leading the way was a man in his 50s, slightly stocky, with a face marked by years of service, but also something hardened, a dry, ingrained discontent. It was Officer Ray Kowski. His eyes were sharp, scanning the Mercedes as if he were examining a piece of merchandise unsuitable for its owner. As his gaze settled on Isabel's face, dark skin, calm features, Kowski's lips lifted slightly, a half-smile that was barely there, but full of meaning. Behind him walked the younger officer, Mark Jenkins, a brisk-looking man with neatly cropped hair, but with a wild, restless look in his eyes, the look of someone looking for fun between shifts. A black woman driving this kind of car? Kowski said quietly, just loud enough for Jenkins to hear. His voice was full of sarcasm, full of meaning. Something's not right here. Jenkins chuckled, nodding in agreement, no reason needed, just an opportunity to intervene. Kowski walked toward Isabel, his gait heavy, his eyes undisguised with scrutiny. Jenkins stood behind him, his hand on his belt, near the gun. He didn't speak, but his eyes kept scanning the interior of the car, as if waiting for a gun or a package of drugs to appear out of thin air. "You were driving a little fast this afternoon," Kowski began, his tone polite but lacking any foundation of respect. A vague excuse, untrustworthy from the moment it was uttered. Isabel showed no anger. She looked him straight in the eye, cool and calm. "Hello, officer. I believe I was driving the speed limit. Any specific issues?" She knew she wasn't. And she knew the drill. Knew it. But Kowski didn't care. "Let me see your license and registration." She slowly opened her purse, took the papers from the glove compartment, and handed them to him without taking her eyes off him. Each gesture was deliberate, a silent challenge. She was used to this kind of stop. Used to people finding a reason to doubt her, as if her existence in an expensive car was a threat. Kowski scanned the papers, his eyes drifting to her elegant dress and the shiny watch on her wrist. He raised his head, emphasizing, "Isabel Sterling." Then he looked back at the interior of the car, as if she had uttered the pseudonym of an aristocrat. "What do you do for a living to afford this car?" The question was not asked for an answer. It was a veiled accusation, a cold stab at her dignity, as if her success was something to be tested. The shiny luxury car reflected the afternoon sun like a silent declaration of the driver's class. But what was happening was not worthy of that flashy appearance. The police officer's question was completely unrelated to the original reason for the stop. Isabel felt a surge of annoyance rising, but she still tried to keep her voice calm and composed. "Officer, my profession has nothing to do with this situation. If I am being stopped for speeding, then please tell me the exact number your device recorded." Meanwhile, Jenkins, the second police officer, quietly circled around to the back, pretending to check the taillights, then slowly moved forward, glancing inside the car through the windshield. His actions were not looking for anything specific, but clearly a ploy to create a sense of pressure, to make the person in front lose balance. Kowski shrugged as if annoyed by the unnecessary question. "Speed is only part of it," he said, his eyes averted. "We also noticed that your windows were a little dark, maybe not up to state standards." Then, with a note of mock apologetic tone, he continued, "And to be honest, a car like this, driven by a woman, by herself, at this hour, on a deserted stretch of road, looks a little unusual. We have reason to suspect that something strange might be going on." Isabel suddenly understood. This was no longer a routine inspection, they were deliberately setting up a series of fake violations to put her in a vulnerable position. "It seems like you're trying to make things complicated," she said, her voice starting to cool. "My windows are state approved, and I'm just on my way home from a long day at work. Nothing out of the ordinary, unless you have some concrete evidence to back them. Otherwise, I demand my paperwork back immediately." The firmness in Isabel's voice was deafening. Kowski didn't get the panic he expected. His face grew serious, and he lowered his voice, leaning toward the window. "I thought you were sensible. We don't want to complicate things. If this continues, the car could be impounded for further inspection. Then you'd have to go to court, wasting time, money, and setting a bad precedent. That would be a problem, right?" He paused, looking her straight in the eye, as if he were suggesting a solution. "The weather's nice, and we're almost off duty. Maybe we can handle this right here. You help us a little, and we'll help you. It's just, nothing's happening, you know what I mean." His thumb and index finger rubbed together, a gesture that couldn't have been more obvious about the money implications. Jenkins stood nearby, eyes distant but ears still attentive, as if waiting for a familiar outcome. Isabel felt a shiver run down her spine. The brazenness of this, the brazenness of a disguised offer, disgusted her. She'd seen too many abuses of power in her career, but when faced head-on like this, it still felt like a slap in the face to her dignity. She raised her head, her gaze sharp, not avoiding it. "Let me be clear," she began, her voice as hard as steel. "First, I have done nothing wrong. And second, I would never, under any circumstances, aid in this kind of corruption." Isabel Sterling sat behind the wheel of the shiny black Mercedes, calm but her eyes like cold knives piercing through the glass windows. She stared at Officer Kowski, her voice firm but not losing control. "If you do not have a clear legal basis or concrete evidence of any wrongdoing on my part, please follow the correct procedure. Otherwise, I demand that you immediately return the documents and let me continue my journey." Isabel's words sounded like an order, not that of a citizen begging, but the warning of someone who knows the law and is not easily bullied. Her eyes did not leave Kowski, and for a moment, he felt as if he was being scrutinized. "What you have been doing, since stopping my car, clearly demonstrates abuse of power, discrimination, and signs of blackmail. Think carefully before you take another wrong step." Isabel's calmness was like a bucket of cold water on Kowski and his partner Jenkins. They had not expected this woman, the one they thought they could easily overpower, to dare to stand up, refuse to compromise, and openly demand justice. Officer Kowski stiffened, his face red with anger at being stopped in the middle of the road. His pride was challenged, his plan for easy money suddenly went up in smoke. "Who do you think you are to lecture me?" he roared, his voice filled with hatred. "A black woman, sitting in a luxury car, what the hell do you think you are?" Racist and sexist profanities poured out like a broken waterfall. Isabel felt her stomach tighten, but she still gripped the steering wheel tightly, not letting herself be dragged into his rage. Jenkins stepped forward, his face cold, his fists clenched. When Kowski slammed a fist into the roof of her car, an act of deliberate aggression, Isabel gritted her teeth, more determined than ever. "You are overstepping your authority as a law enforcement officer. I demand that you call your attorney right now. And I want to speak directly to your commander." Kowski narrowed his eyes, smirking contemptuously. "Call your attorney? Call your commander? Who in the world do you think you are?" He turned to Jenkins and ordered. "Arrest her." Disturbing the peace, resisting an officer, refusing to comply with orders. The charges were coming at a rapid clip. Isabel knew that if she resisted, the situation would only get worse. She took a deep breath, holding on to the belief that the truth and the law would protect her, even if not right away. Isabel stepped out of the car slowly, each step proud, but her voice was firm in the tense air. "You have no right to arrest me. This is a violation of the law." Her protests were like wind blowing through a stone wall. Jenkins did not bother to reply, only stepped forward, gripping her wrists and twisting them behind her back with brutal force. Isabel let out a cry of pain, but did not bow her head. The cold wind whipped her face, but she stood straight, her eyes still blazing. The sound of metal clanging as Jenkins pulled the heavy handcuffs from his belt, locking them around her wrists with brutal force. Her wrists bled as the cold metal cut deep into her flesh. Kowski stood beside her, arms crossed, watching with a look of sick amusement. "See? I told you, stubbornness only brings pain," he muttered, followed by vicious insults, aimed at Isabel's skin color and shape like silent stabs. After handcuffing her, Jenkins pushed her toward the nearby patrol car, so roughly that her head almost hit the door frame. He forced her head down, shoving her into the cramped back seat like a worthless piece of merchandise. The door slammed shut like a cold judgment. Sitting in that small space, Isabel kept her back straight, her eyes staring through the metal mesh, her expression almost motionless. But there was something in that gaze that could not be extinguished, a deep anger, a burning determination, swirling like a storm. She remembered it all, Kowski, Jenkins, the license plate, the time, every word, every touch. They didn't know. They thought this was the end. But she did, the first act of a play had only just begun. And she would write the ending. The patrol car roared away, leaving the expensive Mercedes standing silently in the dying sunset, a forgotten witness in the cold desert of abusive power. On the way back to the station, Kowski and Jenkins laughed heartily, making jokes about the good catch they had just captured. They discussed how they would teach her a lesson when they got there, lost in the drunkenness of cheap power and terrifying ignorance, completely unaware that the woman they had handcuffed was one of the most influential figures in federal law enforcement. And an earthquake awaited them. The car pulled into the parking lot of an old, two-story local police station, nestled in a quiet corner of town. The back door swung open, and Isabel was dragged out of the car like a high-ranking criminal, though her face remained strangely calm. They escorted her down a narrow, musty hallway, straight to the check-in area. Behind the counter, Sergeant Miller, a grizzled man in thick glasses, was taking notes. He looked up when he saw them enter. "What's going on?" he asked, his voice flat and familiar with end-of-shift incidents. "Big fish, Sarge," Kowski replied triumphantly, pushing Isabel toward the counter. "Resisting, disrupting, insubordination." Isabel said nothing. She just looked straight at Miller. Not angrily. Not pleadingly. But like someone who has seen the fate of those who have touched something they shouldn't. That he came in with a cold air, standing tall at the counter as if the world were beyond concern. The driver's license and registration bearing the name Isabel Sterling were tossed on the table with disdain. "Here we go," Sergeant Miller said, gathering up the papers, his eyes sweeping over Jenkins, who had just escorted the woman, with a look that was half doubtful, half familiar. Jenkins was still standing there, arms crossed, a sarcastic smile on his face as if this was some kind of joke he knew the outcome of. Miller put on his glasses, bent over to enter data into the system. Everything was according to procedure, but there was something strange in the air. The woman, despite being handcuffed, stood straight. Her face was expressionless, her eyes cold as steel, challenging all eyes. "Isabel Sterling," Miller repeated the name, his brow furrowed slightly. There was something familiar, but he couldn't quite name what it was that was stirring in his mind. Still keeping his voice even, he asked one more basic question for the record: occupation. That was the moment everything turned. Isabel didn't blink, didn't scream, didn't need to justify. She just answered, each word as hard as a hammer striking hot iron. "Assistant Director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Silence fell over the room like a sudden ice-cold press against a chest. The pen in Miller's hand fell to the table with a dry clatter. His glasses slid off the bridge of his nose, his mouth hanging open. He looked at Isabel, then back at the computer screen as if to confirm what he'd heard. When his eyes returned, they were different, filled with fear and shock. "Assistant Deputy Director of the FBI," he stammered, his voice cracking with shock. And that was just the beginning. Jenkins and Kowski, the two so far arrogant, were petrified. When they heard the title, their faces changed color in an instant, from red with triumph to pale, then ashen. Jenkins's smirk froze in place. His eyes widened, his hands shaking. Cold sweat poured down the back of his shirt as if someone had just poured ice water down his spine. Kowski took a half step back, his legs feeling weak. Everything that had happened just a few hours ago flashed through their minds, the abuse of power, the insult, the intentional slander, and now, they realized, the victim was not just an unknown citizen, but one of the most powerful figures in the country. In an instant, their careers shattered like glass falling from the roof. And not just their careers, their freedom was now more fragile than ever. The two stubborn men, as if punched in the gut, collapsed to the floor, kneeling before Isabel Sterling. There was nothing left to say. There was nothing left to justify. The room remained silent, stunned. All eyes were on the handcuffed woman, no longer a suspect, but a cold mountain of authority standing in the middle of a storm of ignorance. Sergeant Miller whispered, "Deputy Director Sterling." Kowski looked up, his face ashen as if he had just escaped death, or was about to meet the king of hell. Sweat beaded his forehead, his eyes glazed over, Jenkins's voice trembled until it was a faint whisper. "Please, no, we don't know, really, we don't know." He whimpered, barely able to stand. "Please, please forgive us." Jenkins doubled over, almost collapsing on the cold tile floor. His shoulders heaved as he sobbed. I'm sorry, 1,000 times, 10,000 times sorry. It was just a terrible mistake. A stupid misunderstanding. Please, We have a family, please don't ruin our lives. The pathetic plea echoed through the suffocating space of the police station, shaky, choked words from two once arrogant and cold men, now stripped of all their pride. Isabel stood there, her wrists cuffed behind her back, but her eyes were cold, without a trace of mercy. She looked at them, Jenkins and Kowski, with contempt, as if their presence contaminated the air around her. Wordlessly, she turned to the only person still conscious in the chaos. "Sergeant Miller," Isabel said. Cold. Decisive. And filled with an authority that froze the room. "Remove my cuffs. Call your commander. And report to the FBI field office. This requires an agent." Miller blinked, almost forgetting to breathe. "Why yes, Deputy Director," he fumbled for the key, his hand shaking as if he had just touched electricity. The cuffs were removed, and almost immediately, he picked up the phone, his voice stuttering in panic as he reported to his superiors. The real storm began then. The news that FBI Deputy Director Isabel Sterling had been illegally stopped, humiliated, and detained by two local officers exploded like a thunderclap through the law enforcement system. A shockwave rippled through every level, from the small police department to the mayor's office to the federal agencies. Less than an hour later, the police chief, the mayor, and the highest-ranking officials were on the scene. Their faces were blank, humiliated, and terrified. FBI agents from the regional office rushed in, taking over the situation without hesitation. The apologies came pouring in. Isabel took them all with a stoic expression. Not because she was emotionless, but because she knew that the only thing that mattered at the moment was justice. Officer Ray Kowski and Officer Mark Jenkins were immediately suspended, disarmed, stripped of their badges, and detained for investigation. The interrogations were conducted quickly, in parallel between the department and the FBI's Special Investigation Team that deals with abuses and corruption in the law enforcement system. Under the weight of overwhelming pressure and the initial evidence, both men quickly collapsed. No more arrogance. No more excuses. All that remained was the truth, and the inevitable consequences. They blamed circumstances, each other, the system, but in the end, nothing could obscure the truth. A massive investigation was launched, involving close coordination between local police and the Federal Bureau of Investigation, FBI. Every detail, every link of the case was thoroughly examined, from dashcam data, patrol logs, to the detailed testimony of FBI Deputy Director Isabel Sterling. It was Sterling who exposed the chain of lies, the staged traffic stops, the extortion plot, and the illegal arrests. In particular, the work records of two police officers, Ray Kowski and Mark Jenkins, showed many suspicious points. Kowski had a history of complaints about bullying and discrimination, but had never been severely punished. Meanwhile, Jenkins, although younger, also left a black mark with a series of reports of unnecessary use of force. When the victim turned out to be a high-ranking FBI official, and the evidence was overwhelming, the case was quickly turned over to prosecutors. The District Attorney's Office and the U.S. Department of Justice, through the U.S. Attorney's Office, got involved. Kowski and Jenkins faced a comprehensive indictment, including civil rights violations, conspiracy to commit racketeering, false imprisonment, abuse of power, perjury, and obstruction of justice. The trial became a national focus. Isabel Sterling's testimony was not just evidence, but a powerful voice from a victim and a legal expert. The defense was helpless, they could only plead for leniency, blame the pressure of work or a flawed system, but could not refute the intentional and malicious nature of the defendant's actions. When the jury found both defendants guilty, the room fell silent. A moment of justice had been restored. The federal judge handed down the harsh sentences, 15 years in federal prison for each, and emphasized that this was not just punishment for individual acts, but a wake-up call about the dangers of racism, abuse of power, and corruption in law enforcement. The verdict was widely supported by the public, with civil rights groups hailing it as a major step forward in the fight against injustice. The case forced police departments across the country to review their internal oversight, training, and disciplinary procedures. The police departments where Kowski and Jenkins worked have come under increased federal and community scrutiny. For Sterling, the verdict not only brought a sense of justice, but also left her deeply saddened. She understood that this was not a complete victory, but a small step forward in a long battle. But it also made her more determined to use her position and influence to promote change, to defend justice, and to preserve human dignity in a system that sometimes too easily loses it. That evening, as Sterling drove home in the twilight, she knew, her journey was long. But her heart, for all its wounds and ideals, would always burn for one reason: justice, even if delayed, would always prevail.